Hi, so good evening to one and all. Thank you so much for joining this session that Impactree is doing with Catalyst 2030. I know it's been a rich few days that we've been part of many sessions that all of us have been part of. And the best part of the Catalyst 2030 is the fact that there is such a wide audience across the globe that we're getting to actually interact with and exchange notes on how, at the end, we all are aiming at impacting the world. And I think that is really the true strength of Catalyst. And as member organizations, we've been very proud to actually host this session. And thank you for Catalyst and Supriya, as well as Jeru, for giving us this opportunity. So having said this, some of you know Impactree. So Vivek, if you can move to the next slide. So Impactree as an organization, we are very much focused towards building platforms and technology platforms in particular that enhance human capabilities. We work with about 80 plus clients in 10 states in India, largely towards looking at how technology interventions can help community leaders better track and own data from the ground. So that's been really our thesis, that when community leaders take ownership, and especially communities and beneficiaries take ownership of programs, then sustainability is really built from day one. And that's what we've been completely working at. We work with HNIs, corporate foundations, and other, and in non-for-profits and social enterprises. Largely, we work in two major areas, which is rural livelihoods and education. Next, Vivek. In terms of achievements, of course, that we've been covered by multiple forums where we have been participating. And thank you so much, because I can see a lot of friends and family who are there on this call. Next. Yes. In terms of our speakers, so just coming to the meat of the day, that why we are taking aside this 1.5 hours, it is largely from a perspective of understanding how data can really drive social developmental programs across India. What are the key matrices that organizations should be tracking? Especially, it is true that as soon as organizations start data, the first question that comes to everyone's mind is, okay, what IT platform should we use? I think it goes about a fundamental step before, where we really understand that what are some of our obligations when it comes to us organizations which are holding depositories. How is it that we want to design where data is actually used by communities to drive programs, and how is it that we can use frameworks, and how we are going to be in the towards the end sharing experiences on how we have multiple times used social community data and helped organizations to actually better their programs, understanding social cultural embeddedness that actually exists in the communities, and how we can think of them really beyond channel challenges as enablers to community growth. And I think that is really the critical part. So for some of you who don't know me, I am Rajashri Sai. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I've been in this sector for 15 years now. Started off very much as a social activist, and worked in the space of advocacy in India. Largely worked across all villages around the Right to Information Act and the Manrega scheme and the Right to wages that we worked on then. And then from there, I moved on to really working on the developmental sector and addressing some of the core challenges and looking at how livelihoods as an intersection drives water, sanitation, or even adoption of best practices in hygiene in India. So that's what we focus on. And in terms of professional qualification, I've been a lawyer, company secretary, and another life. Of course, I did my MBA and I wore a corporate suit. So it is with that experience that I started Impactree in 2017, largely towards looking at seeing how we can impact 1 million people by 2020. So far, we've been part of programs that have impacted about 700,000 people. So we work with organizations pretty deep in rural pockets in India, and to seeing how we can better their programs. So bringing it to the data management webinar we're going to do today, I think the three key takeaways that we will have from this session is, one, in terms of what are some of the laws that we have to watch out for, how can we actually stay ahead of them and use them as enablers to help organizations adapt to data and data management rules that are just around the corner in India. Secondly, what are some of the frameworks, because this is really from the point of view of practitioner. There's a webinar more for practitioners. So what are some of the frameworks that we use, which organizations like yourself can adapt in rural India to actually better some of your on-ground programs? And the third part of it would be on how do you use social cultural embeddedness as enablers. So this is how it is largely divided into. And just coming back on the speakers, Vivek, if you just go, yeah. So we have three major speakers today. We have Vivek Shankaranarayanan. He's a co-founder of Impactree, and largely he has about 16 years of experience working on with corporates, handling technology and scaling up projects in the petrochemical sites. It was with our understanding of mine of the social sector and Vivek's understanding of data together that seeded Impactree into being the organization we are today. And he's a global speaker with LBS and has completed multiple MBAs from abroad. So, and the second person that we're going to have speaking is Dr. Vanita Viswanath. She is a stalwart when it comes to the sector, especially for relating to women access in India. She specifically was the founder of Udyogini and ex-World Bank. And Udyogini was India's largest women access and enterprise organization and continues to exist. So for over 30 years of she has experience in experiencing on the ground on how social developmental programs can be bettered and how can they be really community-centric and forced. Dr. N. Raveendran is a specialist when it comes, was one of India's leading specialists in insurance and working with minority communities, specifically with communities which are marginalized, and seeing how can they be provided better financial access, how can programs as well as product verticals work, like insurance products that he's worked with Kudumbishri, etc., where how can they be designed keeping community first, and what are some of the specific laws that kick in right now in India, largely which focus on how communities can be centered, how their data can be centered, and how can they be scaled up. So that is, we have these three speakers here. With this, I will sign off, and I will definitely let Vivek take the front in terms of introducing the session to you. Those of you who have any questions, please put together. Vivek, if you could mute. Yes, if you could, I would request participants if they can mute themselves. Hello? Yes. And if largely going forward, yes. So, sorry, yes. So like I said, that this is an open session where we are going to be having any questions that you have, please feel to put them on the chat. And after every speaker basically gives his points of view, we will address questions. This is a practitioner session. So let's get as many questions as possible so that it adds benefit to all of us who are here today. Thank you so much. Vivek, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rajashri. Good evening, everyone. It's a great time to be in the data management space, as they say. At Impactree, like Rajashri said, I have been at Impactree now for the last couple of years. Before that, I came from the manufacturing sector. So data and data systems, processes, those are things which were always there with me. And when Rajashri and we put together the idea of trying to see whether data management could be used in the social sector, I immediately thought, hey, if we could do it in chemicals and oil and gas, how complicated can it be in the social sector? I thought it's just a matter of collecting data, running a few equations here and there, and then, yeah, and we should be able to figure out exactly what happens. 3 years down the line, we've realized that we were probably very naive at that space. We figured out that more important than the math and the models and the platforms and the tools that you use, what's important is that you need to have a set of systems and processes that we take for granted across the world in other sectors, and that's what needs to be brought in here. So over the last 2-3 years, when we have been working with our partners, what we essentially do is this: we build in the systems of processes, set up systems in place, train the teams, and then bring in tools in to act as force multipliers. So at the end of the day, what we work is in essentially doing that. And that's why we took this opportunity to bring out the idea of how do we do data management as a 101, as an initial step for your organizations too. So when we decided to plan on this webinar, we thought that, okay, let's just go out and ask people what is the key pain point which they're facing in their own organization. And the reason why we asked these two questions over here is, one is to understand whether data is a pain point in the organization. And the second is, how aware are our participants itself with respect to data, the requirement of backups and things like that. What we've realized is, for almost everyone here, the problem is not about data or how to collect the data. The question happens to be, what do you do with this data? Sorry. Now, what is important is, in order to understand what do you do with this data, it is important to understand that what are we do, how are we collecting this data, what are we doing with it, and are there any things in place that we can do to probably improve the efficiency? What is equally good is that in order to understand the importance of data backup, almost half the people over here we can see are actually doing data backups at some point of time. Now, that is extremely important because you realize the importance of data management, but you might not realize how do you want to use the data effectively. And that's what we're trying to do in the session today. So to cut it short, what do you mean by data management? Now, in theory, data management is the art of organizing data, collecting data, storing, and protecting our own data sets. Now, while this sounds very simple, what is important to understand that each of these is a niche skill set which needs to be acquired by the organization itself. One cannot depend on external consultant and third-party agencies to come in and do this. What's important is for any company to have a sustainable, or any organization to do this sustainably and organically. It's necessary for the teams in-house itself to acquire all these skill sets and then scale themselves up. And why is this very important? Well, our research has shown that organizations who are able to understand their data and use it to improve decision making are able to see a jump in productivity, efficiency, and operational nimbleness. What I mean by this, especially for someone in the social sector, is that when you're able to showcase your work in a much more effective way, donor responsiveness improves. The second thing what happens is if your data is more transparently indicated to the field teams, the morale across the organization improves. While this is all extremely important, what is also necessary to understand is organizations today are collecting larger and larger chunks of data, as a result of which there are certain risks coming in for which the organizations need to keep checks and balance in place in order to reduce the overall data loss. So a holistic view towards data management is essentially important if you need to have a sustainable organization going ahead. Now, what are the insights? What are the challenges which are there in this? The key challenges obviously happens to be one, the quality of data you're coming in. As the saying goes, it's garbage in is garbage out. So what is important is to see, is the quality of data we're collecting good enough for us just to get good data insights into it. Only when these two things happen do you realize things like data ownership and standardization of systems take place. And when all of these are put together, do you realize that data governance then becomes the key thing which is going to hold everything. So these key challenges are what drive the entire sector today in terms of performance and in terms of compliance. So what do we intend from today's session? So there are three key takeaways that I would like to have people from this session to do. The first is to understand what is the importance of data. Two, rather than looking at platforms, are there frameworks that we can put in our own organizations to collect and analyze this data? And third, how do you create a data-centric organization? So for example, what do you mean by data-centric organization? It means that how can an organization, starting from its field level teams to its CEO, understand data in the right way, that each person in the organization has access to the right data set at the right time so that they can take the right decision. And that's what potentially our key takeaway from today's session. So if we come down to what are the data types that organizations handle, depending on whom we ask, the response is going to be different. If you were to ask a statistician, what do you mean by the types of data? They would broadly categorize it into two. There's either qualitative or there is quantitative. Now, what is important is when you ask somebody in the research sector, if you ask them, what do you mean by data? They would say, hey, there are only two types of data. There's primary data and there is secondary data. But more important to understand is all these data sets mean something or the other to the type of beneficiaries that we are working with, right? So either we work with stakeholders like donors, we work with stakeholders like the government, we have our own internal employees as our own stakeholders. But what is important to note is each of these data sets, whether it be primary, whether it be secondary, or whether it be any of the four types of data distributions which are there, all of these play an important part in trying to understand the key questions of the stakeholders we are trying to work with, and then figuring out, hey, how do we sort those challenges out? So what do we collect? How do we collect data, and what are the key data challenges? So the graph over here is essentially from the data we have collected from all our partners over the last 3 years. And over the last 3 years, what we have been trying to understand is, hey, are there any challenges which they have been facing? And we have realized that effective use of data, yes, is one constant challenge. Over the last year and a half, specifically, we have realized that compliance, specifically with the new GDPR requirements and their equivalent transitions across the world, seem to be new requirements which are coming up. As a result of which, what is happening is that organizations are now forced to think that, hey, can I still collect personal data, keep them on pen and paper or in Excel files, or do I need to work on something better? Now, these are areas which now organizations are looking to see how they can work with and how they can improve. But other than that, if you were to ask some of the key questions to our partners, they would say, okay, we are collecting all this data, but what am I supposed to do with this data? Am I getting any analysis out of it? Are donors able to see our impact? More importantly, although I do baseline, midline, endline, and all these assessments, the sheer amount of time it takes for decisions to take place, what is happening is that I'm essentially doing a post-mortem analysis. Can I do something faster? Then what happens is when organizations work with such lethargy, the ultimate morale in the organization seems to be that, hey, my job is to implement, someone else will do the monitoring. And then what do? We end up depending on external consultants and somebody else to come and do the job for us. What we fail to realize is that both from the donors as well as from the beneficiaries, it is extremely important for data to be visible, because that's the only way decisions improve, impact improves, and as a result of which, if donor visibility improves, that's when fundraising also happens to be far better. So in essence, what we need to realize is organizations now need to move to a data-centric approach. And when they do that, that's when they realize how they're going to become sustainable. So does it mean that organizations have not been doing anything till today? No, not really. The social sector has been running for decades together now, right? Now, what has happened is that primarily data management has been happening through good old register systems, which is pen and paper. And now you've been moving towards Excel, Google Sheets, and some other softwares. And up to a particular scale, organizations do maintain discipline while working with data and trying to collect only the required data. Now, what is happening in the next survey is that as organizations scale across geographies, across sectors, what is happening is the importance in setting the right matrices and then having the right set of processes for data assessment and monitoring. Now, when you don't have an integrated approach, what happens is no one in the organization, specifically at the field level, is able to look at the data and see how it's impacting their program. And we have seen this with organizations we work with. The people in the field, all they keep saying is that someone's collecting this data, so some use must be there. Hopefully someone in the organization is looking at it. And when we go to the CEO of our organizations we work with, they assume that, hey, somebody in my organization must be looking at this data and analyzing it. So there must be something good coming out of it. At the end of the day, if you were to ask someone to iterate what is the impact they're generating, it's pretty much clueless. All have great stories to say, but in terms of numbers, there's hardly anything to back it. That's the reason why we're saying that, hey, you need to have this structure and approach. It's essentially putting a method to the entire madness of data. That's where you'll be able to bring it into place and then figure out how to take care of it and then scale our own programs. So what's the solution? So we have three things to do, basically. First is figure out how you're going to structure your data. The second is how do you collect it smartly? When I mean collect it smartly, it means that just because we need to collect data, don't collect 500 different data sets so you're not going to do anything, just because it has been done as a part of legacy. The third thing we're talking about is how do you deploy it organization-wide, which means everyone in the organization should have some part to play in the data capture, in the data analysis, in the data reporting process. And that's what we will be describing later as what's the solution that we prescribe when we work with partners. So how do we create a data framework for an organization? So like I said, everything happens to be in how you plan, right? In planning, it's extremely important to create a traceable framework and to define accountability. Now, how do you create a traceable framework? What we've done is nothing, it's not rocket science, right? The world has essentially done this since the 50s and 60s when the Japanese came out with Six Sigma. What we have done is essentially change that process and bring in traceability to something which everyone in the social sector is aware, which is the log framework, which we'll just describe later. The second thing is every person in the organization has to be accountable for something. So the next step that we do is link the log framework with the responsibility metrics. That way it becomes easy for people to understand what is going on. It becomes easy to define KPIs and therefore ensure accountability in the system. Now that you've done this entire planning, the next step you need to go to is for the collection. In collection, there are four things which we need to take care of. The first thing is, are we asking the right questions? Now, the point of are we asking the right questions comes back to the planning stage, right? And then we need to understand that, okay, we might be asking the right questions. Are we collecting data smartly? And this is where things like sampling and things like how are you going to distinguish between the population and all that comes, which we will look at. The next thing you need to understand is, are you sure your data is clean? A key challenge we face when we work with partners is to understand, hey, the data we're capturing, is that really clean in terms of, are there errors? Because what we need to realize is that a lot of challenges when it comes to collecting infrequent data, like we collect from questionnaires or qualitative analysis, is that there are lots of chances of human error. Now, how do you ensure that data is clean? The final step, what you need to do is analyze and interpret the data. It's easier said than done, but what's important to note is you do not need to do any complicated analysis. What if you are taking care of the first three steps, but 70 to 80% of your analysis also happens to be far easier. Now, moving towards the analysis, we need to realize there is a differentiation between impact, output, and outcome, and we'll explain to you in the next stages as to how do you differentiate that. But what is important is to notice every stage in the organization has to analyze something in that stage. Either they analyze impact, or they analyze output, or they analyze outcomes. Then give field teams the responsibility to take decisions based on the data they see. When we have worked with partners, what we have realized is the biggest multiplier they get in decision making happens to be when people in the field are able to see the data, not just the collection, but they're able to see the analysis of that data. And as a result of which, they're able to understand where they're going wrong and what actions can be taken in order to change their path. And that's important because you need to then link those matrices to questionnaires to ensure traceability. So, like I said, we started off with planning, which is called creating a traceable framework. And at the end, we ended up with linking matrices to ensure traceability. So the main framework that I propose for people who are trying to create this is create something which is traceable. Often we underestimate the importance of this, and it's extremely key because only when you do this do you realize where your pain points are and what are the secondary steps which are needed to be taken in order to improve ourselves. So like I said, at Impactree, what we have done is essentially taken the Six Sigma process and created it and tailor-made our own framework, essentially for our data needs, right? So we created a 4-step process over here called establish, assess, improve, and sustain. Now, as easy as it sounds, what's important is ultimately this is a tool to structure the problems which happens in establish. In assess, it happens to be a pathway to collect the right data sets. In improve, it happens to be a pathway of are we analyzing it the right way and are we implementing it the right way. The final one is sustain. This is where we complete the loop that, okay, on the basis of this, are you able to do a variance analysis and therefore understand, okay, what are now the things which need to be done to move ahead and work better? The second thing which I said we need to do is create a responsibility matrix. So if you can see here, there is a 4-step, there's a very well-known project management tool, which is called the RASI matrix, which we have essentially deployed for our partners. What we do over here is every person in the organization happens to fall in one of these 4 buckets over here. Now, over each of these buckets, they are responsible for every single outcome which is there in a program. Now, what we do is each step of the program is therefore split, and each stage is therefore given a particular accountability or a responsibility system. And depending on this, their activities are tracked and their accountabilities are defined and their KPIs are basically ensured. And when you're able to do this, we have seen that therefore organizations are able to build in better accountability. Now, there's a reason why we've been using the terms impact, outcomes, outputs. We've seen that far too frequently. People, when we're working with social outcomes, we totally tend to loosely use the words impact and outcomes together. What I realize is there has to be a necessity to differentiate this. So what we do is when we work with our partners, we basically start off from the high level objective of a program, and we've basically showcased an example later on. We start with the high level objective of program, understand what are the key activities for that particular program, and to achieve those activities, there are tasks. Now, each person in the organization is responsible for achieving either an objective or an activity or a task. On the measurement side, what happens is those are classified as outputs, outcomes, and impact. What we have realized is that unless you are able to bring in this definition at an early stage into the program, it becomes extremely difficult for you to then build the questionnaires and the KPIs to track these. As a result of which, in order to establish this data collection platform, the first thing we say is, hey, you need to link your objectives to your activities and tasks. Sounds very simple, right? More importantly, the idea is you need to quantify your objectives in order to understand what is the impact you're targeting. Now, for each activity, you need to link the outcome matrices which need to be done. And subsequently, for each activity, also identify the task and link the outputs for them. Now, what happens is that the outputs therefore become the KPI or the key performance indicators to track the performance of our field teams, while outcomes become the key performance indicators for the project teams, while impact is now therefore seen at a programmatic level. So what we've done is, in a nutshell, we have defined the whole problem of, hey, okay, how do I look at an organization or a program-wide impact? But to achieve that impact, there are a lot of things which need to fall into place. My assumption is that if all those things fall into place, impact eventually happens. And that's the whole process with which we are going ahead. So it's extremely important to identify the objective, move on to activities and tasks, and for each of these link the outputs, outcomes, and the impact. So, like I said, this is basically the framework that we have developed, and I'll just give you an example of how we have done it. So, for one of our clients, who's one of India's largest career guidance agencies, essentially for children in Tier 3, Tier 4 villages, they basically had a question on, hey, okay, are we really seeing impact in what we were doing? So the first step we asked them was, okay, let's understand what do you mean by education outcomes through career guidance. They said that, okay, I want to understand and see what are the percentage change in gender enrollment. Are children moving into non-STEM related activities? And the third thing is, okay, when they are eventually moving from education to career, are they able to see improved career retention programs? And at the end of it, are the kids actually able to see a satisfaction increase in their jobs? So what we did was we said, okay, in order to achieve this objective, these are the KPIs that you need to be working on, right? But from objective to impact, it doesn't reach that way. There are major sets of activities. So for example, the organization runs counseling programs and career fairs. But to achieve those counseling programs, what happens is they need to do several tasks. So they need to get schools on board, they need to run psychometric tests, they need to do guidance sessions for the students. They also need to do guidance sessions for the parents. That's a very unique challenge, right? So for all of these, what we said was, okay, now for these, let us identify the outputs. And for achieving these outputs, there are questionnaires which are designed, right? And in order to achieve these outputs, the idea is that if you achieve these outputs, it will lead to an improvement in outcomes, which will lead to an improvement in impact. And this is how, while an impact might take about 2 to 3 years to be achieved, as long as we are targeting outputs and outcomes at the desired frequencies, we will be able to achieve impact. So that's the logic with which we are working on. And now if you see here, now what we have done is built a structured approach to the whole process of data management. Over here, you're going to be having activity level data, essentially, right? So there are tasks which are going over here. There are individual tasks which are going on. To achieve this outcome, you have done these set of activities, and then you have achieved your impact. So that's essentially the process by which we take our partners through in order to understand how they can scale their programs. And it's a similar approach which we do not only for education, but we've done this for health and we've done this for livelihoods also. Now, there are two, now that we have defined the entire process, let's understand how do you capture data. Now, there are two ways in which you can capture data. There is either a qualitative assessment or there is a quantitative. Qualitative happens to be the most frequently used method, which is there. We have a slightly different approach. What we feel we do is we do a qual and a quantitative approach. So in a qualitative and quantitative approach, what happens is the qualitative is used to set up the hypothesis. So for us, when we do our qualitative assessments and interviews, it's to set up the broad hypothesis in which the detailed questionnaires are going to be built. And in order to understand what that happens, we try to figure out, okay, based on your objectives and based on the activities and the tasks that we're trying to go through, we need to figure out how do we define systems and processes and KPIs. And once these are done, you build up the questionnaire for it. And then we do on things like FGDs, there are PRAs and activities like that, which are undertaken to understand the qualitative assessment. What is important now is the learnings from the qualitative assessment are then used to define the quantitative questionnaire. While defining the quantitative questionnaire, it is important that we target a population as large as possible. Now, this is where technology comes into play. Where we said is a force multiplier is essentially this. So in quantitative, the primary challenge happens to be how do you send people into the field and collect data? right? Because that's the most cost inefficient way of doing it, which is where you have platforms coming in, you have forms which can be filled online. But more importantly than all this is trying to understand the learnings from qualitative and defining them into quantitative questionnaires which can be targeted. So for example, at Impactree, when we target on quantitative, we target the entire population. The reason why we do this is because it takes care of all the errors which are there when we do with sampling. And we are able to understand that, hey, okay, when these challenges are taking place, how is it that we can take care of the entire population itself? However, what we have realized is that in order to avoid response fatigue, and this is something which very commonly happens, there is a sweet spot in the amount of time it takes for responses. So for example, for offline interviews, we have realized that it's about 12 minutes and for 8 minutes for online. The reason why we have come to these numbers is because when we have done our focus group tests, we've seen that more time than this, we start to get bland responses from the beneficiaries itself. And as when we start doing that, then that pretty much negates the purpose of doing this assessment. One of the clients that we were working with, take the name out, but when they were working on contract labor improvement and negotiations, what I realized, the questionnaire had something like about 460 questions. Now, the problem with something like that is that at the end of the day, there is a fatigue with the people that you're trying to collect this data from. And the second thing is, after collecting the data, there's not really much of an analysis you're doing in it, because you're collecting a lot of data sets which you have been collecting for legacy reasons, and there's not much of an output which is coming from that. And that's the whole point of us saying that you need to be very crisp and clear in how you're asking the questions and in what KPIs you're doing. Again, this translates back to the point that we were saying, hey, are you able to set up frameworks and processes that's able to take care of these? Oh, sorry. Now, the next question I want to say is about the next point I want to indicate is, are we getting enough inputs to supplement our field level decisions? So for example, the first thing which I mentioned before is ensure that your data is clean. So this graph over here, this chart over here essentially indicates for the about 40,000 data sets that we have on our platform, what are the most common data errors that we have found. So about 77% of the errors which we see in data collection happens for 3 matrices, which is name, the location where they are, the place where they're staying, and third is their own mobile numbers. And as a result of which, it's extremely important to therefore create beneficiary enrollment systems. So for example, in our platform, we have a beneficiary enrollment form. When once that happens, they're given a unique ID for themselves. Once this beneficiary creation tracking system is in place, that ensures that your common errors are all eradicated. As a result, it improves the analysis process. Now, what's also important is what I put over here is every stage in the organization or every person in the organization is responsible for data collection and analysis at some level. So what's important is, unless the field teams happen to have access to the data which they're collecting, and unfortunately, a lot of organizations that we see do not give their field teams the freedom to see this data and take action on the basis of this data. Unless we do things like that, we're not going to see ownership change across the organization. So what's important is that field teams are able to look at their own outputs and performance and then understand what are the challenges happening in them and how they can achieve those targets in a better way. When we're talking at an impact level, it's important that the program managers who are at least closer to the field teams are able to collect this data and analyze this data. Because unless we are able to do these kind of actions, it's extremely unlikely that the organization will become data centric. The next point, where, like I said, was move from collection frameworks to data collection to analysis, right? The important takeaway I want to have from this is that we need to understand why we are building inferences in order to create sustainable programs. See, the biggest mistake that we make is we assume that analysis is math. Actually, it's not. The idea is to understand if there are patterns and trends in analysis. And that's the reason why it's important that people are looking at outputs and frameworks and data sets and trying to understand, hey, is this data making sense? Are these analysis points making sense? If they do, then it makes sense in understanding, okay, why is this happening? So the important thing is we fail to ask the question why, and we depend on external people to tell us, hey, is this making sense to you? But what is important is to note that unless our own people, our own teams, unless they are able to take, let me say, ownership for the data, only then can we see actually outcomes improve. So, like I said, so the important thing over here is now to focus on the process, and the idea is that the results will automatically flow in, right? That's the key takeaway which I want for people over here. The idea is, how do you build systems, frameworks, and processes? So, like I said, the first thing is link your objectives to activities, to impact, to outcomes and tasks. Only when you do that will you be able to figure out that, hey, oh, am I able to ensure traceability across the system? Am I able to ensure every person in the organization is able to take action on the basis of this data? And third, only when all these things happen do I realize that, hey, beneficiaries are able to understand what's going on. Not only that, donors are also able to get this visibility. Now, what happens in all these things is the entire organization then starts to improve their morale in trying to figure out, oh, data is not this thing that requires this huge technology platform. It needs a database, it needs tools and dashboards. They realize that data management is a set of simple processes and activities which can be done. And by doing that, even the most simple of Excel dashboards are more than enough to take care of it. Now, the final thing we need to understand is, does it mean technology is absolutely useless, that it doesn't do anything? No, absolutely not. I mean, we wouldn't have built our own platform if that was the case. But what we've realized is that technology happens to essentially be a force multiplier. What do I mean by a force multiplier? Today, when you're collecting data sets for about 100,000 people, yeah, sure, Excel might make sense. But when you're doing this for 500,000, for about a million people, then yes, you need to have databases in place. You need to have monitoring dashboards. You need to have more of a technology tool which helps you scale the performance. Now, for all those few who are trying to evaluate technology performance, what is key you need to understand is, does it actually help the field team to use it? The second is, how does it help in minimizing data collection errors? The third, and what Dr. Raveendran will probably talk about, is it really ensuring data privacy? I mean, I've gone in enough times into the field and seen a lot of platforms where the data is just lying open over there. Anybody can really access it. More importantly, is, does any platform actually let me trace the history of a beneficiary? The reason I say this is because while social sector organizations really do the best at what they're doing, unfortunately, a lot of biases also tend to creep in. And only when we start tracking as to the history of a beneficiary in the organization do they realize, oh, are there actually sustainable changes happening? And finally, the ultimate point for any platform also has to be, does it simplify donor reporting? I mean, at the end of the day, investing in all these tools and platforms, if it doesn't take care of either the beneficiary end problems or the donor end problems, it doesn't really solve any purpose. So with that, I would like to conclude my part of the session and leave the forum open for any questions.
So Vivek, there were two specific questions. One that came up from the point of Manta, who said that data gathering and collection is often quite costly. So are there any open source tools for waste management and upcycling centers which can use it and make it simpler for organizations to track data? That was the first question. And second was Enifon Odo Nutenboik, I'm sorry if I got your name wrong, from Nigeria. He said, how do you ensure data security? So these are the two specific questions.
So I'll go with the first one about the cost of data platforms. See, in reality, a data platform is as expensive as what you want it to be. Okay, we have seen for a fact that the best of platforms can actually be for free. In fact, in today's day and age, what we have been seeing with clients is that you have low code platforms, you have no code platforms, you have enough and more of these things in place. The more important question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the expense that you really need to do to solve the problem? So for example, if the scale of your data isn't huge, there is no reason for you to invest in expensive systems. And clearly see that the organizations have been working for ages together before all these tools came into place, right? Tools are just a new thing today. I mean, we've seen organizations work very well with just pen and paper. So if pen and paper can work well for organizations collecting about 500,000 people's data, why can't it be? Why should it be expensive? What is important to realize is that solving our problem today? And going ahead, is that going to take care of the data privacy issues, right? So data expensive, I would say, is only as expensive as the person you want to see it. I mean, you can get it as cheaply done and fit for your purpose, absolutely. Or you can go to any of the expensive consultants who are selling you these solutions anyway. So it doesn't make too much of a difference there. With regards to data privacy, see, what I want to say is that And no system is completely secure. There are issues which are going to be there, and that's the reason why, or even GDPR actually mentions about audits and systems like that, right? Because no system is 100% secure. What is important to note is, are we collecting the data that we're collecting? Is that really a reason for collecting the data? I mean, I've seen organizations collect data like Aadhaar and unique identification data where they don't really need to. There is absolutely no necessity for it. The question is, why are we even collecting those data points when there is no use for it? So what we need to think is, one, are we collecting the right data sets? The second is, how do we ensure checks and balances within our organization to ensure that data stealing, data theft doesn't happen? So these are the two things which are important, for which even encrypted Excel files also do the job. But it's important for everyone in the organization to understand this, that there is a cost to what happens, and as a result of which there have to be checks and balances in place, and that's the only way data can be truly secure.
Sure, thank you, Vivek. Now I think that we can call in, if any further questions are there, feel free to put them on the chat and happy to take it in. I think we'd now go to Dr. Vanita Viswanath for her points to, and where she will explain, or rather bring forth her experience in looking at social cultural paradigms, which actually play a huge value to data, especially from the collected from the field, because many times they are actually viewed as challenges, but really they are they are enablers to actually help communities really structure their program, and are critical to for communities to start taking ownership of data.
Rajashri, thank you.
Yes.
And let me just take off a bit from what Vivek said, which is the fact that it's important to know why you're collecting something, and it's not a question of how much, it's not a question of where, when, how. I think it's about why. And I can you just show me the first slide, Vivek? Now this is where we do have a more important reason for collecting data. And I think the kind of data we will collect is actually going to change a bit from what it is that we had earlier thought, perhaps. And I think this is as changes happen. As the world becomes more complex, I'm afraid the data gathering process and the data analytics process will also become more complex. I don't think we can avoid it, because frankly, the cost of data collection is minor compared to the cost of very poor impact on organizations, on communities. So I think investing in data, in the whole data process, is rather more important than worrying about its cost at the very beginning. So there is a growing clamor for accountability or environmental and social impact. So it's not just the out there CSR that we are talking about, but integrated as ESG now. So the measurement requirements are bigger and more complex, because you've added things to this. You've added environment and you've added social, and you know how difficult it is in the environmental social to be broken down into sort of unit levels. Does more mean better, especially if it becomes more standardized as tech intervenes? What will it miss for results? These are questions to be asked. So data collection, tracking, and results reporting has to align with the sustainability purpose. It's for both customer and ecosystem impact. And I'd like to emphasize this. In the real world, they are not in silos, even if visibility and voice are not apparent. Now, this is something that's terribly important, because it's, when you focus only on a customer, the reason what has happened with climate, with the focus on social, is that you focused very narrowly on product, on the customer, and then you've discovered that after having done all of that, the impact on the ecosystem hasn't been great. So it can have negative fallout on the ecosystem. So you have to actually see this as one composite composite, data sets, if you like, if you focus on both customer and the ecosystem, which you have to do together. Focusing mainly on the obvious and the easily measurable, which is usually the quantitative one. How much income, how many people are there in a household, what is the education levels, and then you draw a bunch of conclusions just based on that kind of sort of limited hard data. They can have critical negative impact in the long term. We know what has happened actually. When social disruption has occurred, companies have had to pack up and leave in social areas where they've caused ecological destruction. So that's how the whole focus on environmental and social impact even came, because everybody knew what the fallout was. And it's largely the fact that you've been very narrowly focused, you've ended up with social disruption. Next one. Okay, data has to actually serve two purposes, both end results and course corrections. Vivek actually used outputs and outcomes as your intermediate steps between a baseline and an end line, and the end results or impact, if you like. And I have generally called it a course correction because outputs and outcomes, if you track it, you generally will be able to find reasons for course correcting, because that's when you will find out what has worked and what has not worked. So actions have to be kept upgraded in response to mid-course situations and require pivoting. So outputs and outcomes will help you to actually change how it is you do your programs. And in a large part, the context in which I am speaking has to do with the community level programs and particularly in livelihoods, because that's where I come from. But it doesn't matter. It can even be within organizations. Within corporate organizations, within social sector organizations, it is the same thing. You have to do your mid-course corrections. Otherwise, you're going to lose people or you're going to have poor impact of your program. So this is both for positive as well as and the good, as well as for the fallout and the negative impact. Data has to be inclusive. There's a lot of talk about inclusiveness these days, but I don't think it's ever applied to data. And both the obvious and the visible, which are the quantitative, and the not so obvious, contextually driven, which are embedded in culture and local practices. This is a very neglected area of assessments. Even in qualitative assessments, it is neglected. And now with the focus on data and tech, it seems to have receded even further. So this, I think, needs to be brought back center stage into data work, particularly, as I said, for the imperatives for a sustainable world. It allows a better understanding of customer and his or her ecosystem influences, which will not fit a standard profile in a rapidly changing world, as well as improving the ability of the intervening agency to decide and act on necessary trade-offs based on evidence. Nobody is doubting the importance of trade-offs, but you could end up with the wrong set of variables on which to make those decisions if you do not look at culture and you don't look at context and you don't look at the embeddedness of things. You know, there was a very funny incident I read where somebody went into a Mercedes-Benz showroom. I think it was in Delhi or in Chennai, I forget, one of the metro cities here. And he was wearing an Indian dress. And he was wearing a dhoti and a kurta. Apparently, the dealer didn't take a second look at him and more or less tried to dissuade him from thinking that he was the kind of customer who could afford a Mercedes-Benz. And apparently, the gentleman waited for a little while, then finally took out his bag and took out wads of hundreds and thousands of rupees and put it on the table and said, "How much does your Mercedes-Benz cost? I can buy not one, but several of them." So this actually ended up being a real case study for Mercedes-Benz, and they had to change the way they trained their dealers to understand that it's got nothing to work about the dress you wear. And because many people who are really well off in India and South India do not wear business suits. They wear dhotis and kurtas, and they are perfectly, people who can afford things. So anyway, so this is just a little interesting anecdote, I thought, which is exactly right, which is that this is not a standard profile. And if you don't keep culture and context in mind, you could actually lose a customer when you actually are trying to sell something. Next one. So cultural factors as enablers. So you've got lifestyle, you've got beliefs, you've got value system, you've got communications, and you've got traditions. The reason I use the word enablers is because so far, you take any document, you take the UN goals, you take anything, culture is seen as a constraint. We tend to always complain about culture. I don't know whether you've noticed that. You take any book on development, you'll see, culture is this, culture holds women back, culture makes men do this, behave this way. It's all about all the negative impacts of culture. But have we ever thought of the fact that culture could actually be an enabler? If you look hard enough, and just the example I just gave, it's about how you didn't look properly, you didn't look at the right things about a culture before you made the decision that this was not the right kind of customer. So what I'm saying is that if you look at it as a constraint, you will only see that dhoti and the kurta. You will not see the customer. So you will not see any other part of the customer. So because you already made that assumption in the first 5 minutes. So what I'm trying to see is that you have to dig deeper to find these enablers. Yes, it's work. It's work for data, for sure. And it's work for research. And it's work for data gathering. But you have to look at them as enablers, because if you do look at them as enablers, you are actually going to find a lot of support for your project that you may be missing if you look at things as constraints. Next. Enablers for knowledge. Culture is in two ways. Enablers for knowledge and enablers for action. Researching metrics design and tracking on individual and community beliefs and practices can enable the right knowledge of what to harness for better outcomes. For example, pollution norms for sanitation. The whole toilet story that has been really widely recognized as being a success story and so on. Many years, building toilets didn't mean toilets were being used for toilets. I have myself seen toilets being used for storing grain. The reason being that you didn't ask the community where you wanted where they should place the toilets, because somebody else came and built the toilets. So most communities in India will not build toilets inside the home. They build them outside because toilets are considered polluting. So if you say they have to be an extension of your homestead, the chances are they will not use it as a toilet. So this was a real good example of how huge money got wasted in government programs on toilet building long ago. I mean, they've rectified it now because they paid attention to culture. Culture is well navigated and negotiated by communities for their own equilibrium. For example, kinship-based networks that are trust circles for social exchange. Being inclusive of such networks and interventions will help to sustain outcomes in the long term. Communities, have their own ways of doing things. And it's for us, and it's for data to search for it. It's for data to find it. And you have to go with the view that you are going to look for things that is likely to bind communities, not the ones that divide communities. So they navigate, they negotiate, they talk within themselves, they figure out how to do things. We don't have to tell them how to do it. So these are the ways in which you have enablers for action. You go and find out focal point of the equilibrium that happens within a kinship network. And these are the data points that will be an enabler for your program. Next. Just to give you an example of what are the differences between a visible indicator and a cultural one. These indicators can be easily tracked. Like I said, they're hard data. You can see them, they're visible. You'll know how many members of a family there are. By the way, you may not know how many members of the family there are also if you don't ask. Some people migrate. And when you're asked a question, how many members are there in your family, they probably tell you about the numbers who are presently there in their family, who are physically present. If you do not ask the question, if there are any members of the family who are not there, you are not likely to know that they may have 1 or 2 members who have migrated to another city. So even for a visible indicator of how many members, or just the quantitative understanding, you have to ask some deeply embedded cultural questions. Cultural indicators are not easy to be tracked. Yeah, that is true. Because you have to really dig. Visible indicators are measurable, and most of them are collected as quantitative data. And these are collected as part of qualitative data. Cultural indicators generally are. But I know that in the tech world, there will be this question as how will you convert this qualitative data into quantitative? It is possible to do it. And I think we can use ranking methodology for doing it. But the key thing here is to ask the community to do it. Because it's an embedded thing. It comes from within themselves. Okay. Age, gender, income, education levels are all some of the visible or obvious indicators. In the cultural case, cultural tools of family negotiation on sharing care work. Spiritual mechanisms for improving an emotional coping capacity during economic downturns. That actually is also very cultural. Because we may assume that a community is unable to cope. They are down in the dumps, they are doing badly, they're doing this, that, and the other. And then you will find out, if you don't ask the right question and if you are not sensitive, that they have coped quite well. And the reason they have coped is they have got somebody in their community who has helped them figure out the methods. And they maybe have spiritual mechanisms by which they do this. Ways of integrating ecology and economics in culture that promote sustainability. One of the things that in culture there is, at least in Indian culture, ecology and economics are very integrated. But while we study economics and while we research economics data, we don't integrate ecological data. But that's a very strong duality that is integrated that promotes sustainability. So if you miss the ecology bit, your economics bit is probably not going to work. So, and that is because when communities do economics, they also think of ecology. So they are inherently sustainable in their thinking process. But this has to be captured in data. Next. Vivek, I think, can I just go back? I think we missed, there's a number 2 slide that tells you what do I mean by embeddedness. Just a minute. Can you just go back for a second? No, there was one somewhere. Okay, never mind. Maybe it's not. Yeah, okay. Cultural matrices for continued tracking of impact. At the beginning of the project, baseline, I've called it midline. Vivek, you've used outputs and outcomes as sort of a midline, right? So this is the stages. There are 2, you could call them 2 stages in between, okay, between baseline and endline, where you have to continuously track these indicators, your cultural indicators, to see if they are functioning or they are impacting at that point in time in the same way as I assumed it is doing when you did the baseline. So you have to be very careful with cultural indicators, because culture it's always in flux. There are a variety of influences on a family, and there are a variety of responses to that. So you have to track it as almost like a full continuum, okay, and do the course correction. I can't emphasize enough the importance of course correction, because your end line is likely to work more positively if you fix the problems as they occur while the programs are in progress. Again, while there's nothing to do with development only, it has to do with your own organization as well. So if you wait to track these things and then you discover, oh my God, I made a mistake at the end of the program, I don't know why this went wrong, this was not supposed to be the way it was, I was expecting this result and something else happened. Well, this probably because you did not pay attention during the course of the program as to the changes that were happening with the community, because you were looking at it from the outside in, number one. And secondly, you were not tracking the data that you started out with. You sort of somewhere the cultural data got sort of left behind because you were then suddenly concerned with the more visible, the more quantitative. When your tech came into it, and you suddenly said, okay, oh, tech means I have to do the more obvious ones. But let's be careful. Let's make sure that we integrate this well, even during the course of the program. Next. Okay. I'm giving some examples here. It was of how Impactree did it. You know, there was a project in rural Maharashtra where they discovered that, you know, it was not, the problem was not what the NGO had identified, which is about institutional deliveries. The problems for miscarriages and mortality and anemia was not the lack of institutional delivery, because that was the obvious one. They correlated two things which probably didn't need to be correlated, but it was actually the fact that women married before they were 20 years of age. That's a cultural thing. Getting early marriage is a cultural issue. So if you're not paying attention to that, the reason for something which is cultural might be interpreted as something that is to do with the interventions in the ecosystem that were lacking, or yes, lack of institutional deliveries, which what the NGO found out. So the data point that Impactree did with this was culture. I mean, there was an attempt to look at whether there was another reason for this, and it turned out it is to do with culture. Next one. Yes. In an NGO, Impactree provided an NGO in Jaipur for combining skill upgradation in their traditional kantha work. Kantha work is handwork, with tailoring skills on sewing machines that women already own. Now, how did the women actually own this? It's part of their culture there to gift women sewing machines during marriage. So this was an asset that was already acquired by the families as part of a cultural practice. It was not given by a donor, it was not given by the NGO. It was acquired. So you can actually build on such things, a program on such things, when you know that the asset acquisition has already happened. And it was understood as a cultural norm and built on simultaneously. So then the choices were available, which is you can actually do kantha work, which is job work, which they were already doing, but job work is for somebody else. Or since you already have an asset which is given to you when you get married, you can build on your skills on that and go and do tailoring if you like. So then you had a choice of two enterprises that you could do. Next one. This was a kinship ecosystem. I mentioned kinship earlier, promoting embedded trust. In the assessment of an organization which forms and facilitates communities of weavers and artisans, there was already a kinship promoting trust happening. Trust meaning not institution, but trust being, trust building process. So there was already an embedded trust in a small group of people that were working together as weavers. They were exchanging, the social exchange happened, the business exchange happened. they were already doing some things with each other. They were able to sustain this during the pandemic. In fact, they were able to do quite well. Part of the reason is that the NGO came in that worked with them, expanded this trust circle, added more weavers to it. At the kinship system ecosystem actually was promoted and solidified. The result was that they were able to use that circle of trust for the business exchanges that subsequently helped their businesses to sustain during the pandemic. Is there another one? Is it? Yeah. A third one. There is another one example. This is an ecotourism organization we set up in a tribal village. For ecotourism, you see, it's very interesting. Ecotourism hits many different cultural aspects. It hits ecology, promotes ecology. It promotes, a cultural connect to the area where this is being promoted. And it also does livelihoods work. So it actually does a combined capacity to do many different things if you use culture as your input into this. So the program actually did a lot of things about setting up ecotourism, but what it did was, because it was a successful livelihood program, it brought back a lot of people who had migrated, came back to the villages and reconnected with their cultural roots, and then used a lot of their ecologically sustainable methods that they were using before for improved chulas and things traditional. They started doing the traditional artwork like pottery. These were skills that were being lost. So the advantage of taking culture as a center stage, like I said before, is that you can do excellent livelihood programs. You can actually then also promote it as a heritage quotient, and you can also embed that culture within communities that might be losing it. Is that the last one?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, Vanita.
Thank you so much, Vanita. There was just one question from Mamta, and she said that she had earlier asked a question regarding, data embeddedness in cultural and local practices. We seem to have answered it during your conversation, but she said that, do you remember also of any program that failed due to ignoring culture or local aspects in your experience and years of work?
Well, toilet example I gave already. It basically failed to do what it was supposed to do, which is use toilets for sanitation. Ended up using toilets for gain work, for storage. So that was one clear, and it was a massive failure across India. I mean, not recently, I'm talking about 20 years ago, when it was first started. Then, as I said, course correction happened. Other things had to do with handwork. If you there is a lot of new skill work that is being communities are being trained to do. Many of them already have a traditional skill. If you're going to introduce a brand new skill of handwork, the uptake on it is harder, and you could end up not succeeding because they are used to traditional skill. And actually what we should be doing is building on what they already know. And I know craft programs which have failed because they did not build on what women already knew, or make that more marketable.
Thank you so much, Vanita. That was really very useful from a perspective of understanding that there could be actually other cultural parameters that drive programs and how they scale. And now, moving to the last part of today's webinar, I would like to invite Dr. Raveendran to really talk to us about some aspects which already was raised by some people regarding data security and how important it is in the current regulatory framework, and give us expert opinion in terms of what are some of the systems that we are actually heading to and we as organizations should be prepared for. So like always, being cognizant of the time, please do post your questions on the chat screen, and happy to take it together after Dr. Raveendran finishes. Thank you so much.
Uh, Good evening, friends. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Uh, Before I begin, I will, as I always do, I would do a recommendation of a book that is relevant for the topic today. I read a book called Age of Surveillance Capitalism a few sometimes back. It's written by an author called Shoshana Zuboff. Uh, it's available in Amazon and Flipkart. You can order it. If you're a reader, you should actually try and. It's a huge book. It will take some time to read, but it's a very good book considering that what we are likely to see in future with respect to the use of data. That's number one. Number two, there are a couple of stories that I want to tell you before we move into this presentation. The first story I want to tell you is about the uh, Indian government's ban of 118 apps last year. There were a lot of applications that got banned by Indian government. One would wonder, why did they do it? I mean, TikTok was a very popular application and various other applications. But what the government found was that they were collecting extensive information about the citizenry, about the people, and they were creating a huge repository with which they can do some phenomenal cross tabulation, and they would be able to derive some insights. Some of it, I mean, on another occasion, on another platform, I can go on and explain you how collecting innocuous looking data can be made it into a very useful and economically beneficial insight. They were collecting data from users clipboard. They were collecting their GPS location, collecting vital network related information like your Wi-Fi network access point or your IP or your local IP, etc. Now, what does this do? You can do a lot of things with this kind of information when you really put your mind to it. And the government of India identified that, and they also saw to the dangers of these kind of data leaks, so they had banned the application. That's one. The second story is about what happened during last presidential election in 2000 when Trump and Trump was standing for election for the first time. There was a company called Cambridge Analytica in England. Actually, there was a researcher called Alexander Kogan. He's a data scientist. Actually, he developed a program where then he joined hands with Cambridge Analytica, and they tied up with Facebook. They said, okay, we will do some study, which was mainly for academic purpose. It started off as a study for academic purpose. So they started sending out questionnaire to simple, ordinary looking questionnaire to people in the Facebook with certain profiles. They took consent with them, and they also said that we will pay you if you respond to those queries. Then what they did is it not only collected information from the people to whom they have sent, they have also collected information from all their friends in in your Facebook page. So they collected without taking consent from them, and they had collected 87 million responses through this, which then was used to an extent of, which is an allegation, it was not proved, but influencing the election, US presidential election, to a large extent trying to influence the Brexit referendum. So all these kind of things. The point I want to stress here, gentlemen and ladies, is that when we consider data to be a simple information about any personal thing and really does not have a big value, but there are organizations which use and mine this data to create huge economic wealth. In knowledge economy, data is considered to be your critical asset. Now, how the data is collected, managed, and used will decide on how wealthy you will become. And one case in point is Google. Today, Google actually knows you more about you than you. Or if you are an active Facebook user, Facebook knows a lot of information about you. If you are in LinkedIn, LinkedIn knows lots about your professional career, knows about your interest, professional interest, knows about your professional connects. So these are companies which exist and make money only on data. Please remember that. Today the startups are called unicorns when they reach a valuation of about $1 billion. In the last 10 years, if you look at these total number of percentage of unicorns which have been only using data to create economic wealth, it is about 83%. 83% of global unicorns, startups, have depended on only data to create their economic wealth. That is how important the data is. Now, while it presents an opportunity for an economic entity to really use the data for their benefit and for the societal benefit, but it is also, on the other hand, becomes a big headache for the governments that the data, because unlike a physical asset where it can be actually protected within your geographical boundaries, data is geography agnostic. So somebody sitting in Ukraine can hack into your system, take away your data and put it in a market. Somebody sitting in the US can buy it and actually use it for his own benefit. So it is completely geography agnostic, and that poses a problem for all the governments. So that is why you will find that more and more countries are becoming very, very stringent on how the data is to be protected. While we will, when we go through this presentation, we would be discussing more about how GDPR has evolved, but we will be focusing more on what the Indian regulations are likely to do on the same lines as GDPR, because the data protection bill is still not enacted. It is still yet to be enacted. But it's very soon it is going to be enacted, and when it does get as an act, we will see that it will have a greater impact for people who are processing data, right? Let's go to the first slide. What exactly is data? I will touch upon two definitions of what data is about from two different acts. The first act is the Indian Information Act, because let's focus on Indian laws. Indian Information Act of 2000, when it defined data under section 2, it said data means representation of information, knowledge, facts, concepts, or instruction which are being prepared or have been prepared in a formalized manner and is intended to be processed, is being processed, or has been processed in a computer system or computer network, and maybe in any form, including computer printouts, magnetic, optical storage, media, punched cards, punched tapes are stored internally in the memory of computer. Now, remember, this whole thing, when it talks about the data, it is focusing on the information residing in a computer system or a computer network. Come to data protection bill, which is actually going to be enacted in section 3, which defines various definitions of the terms. Section 3 defines data as data includes representation of information, facts, concepts, opinions, or instructions in a manner suitable for communication, interpretation, or processing by humans or by automated means. Now, that is a big difference. It is not talking about computer system or a computer network. It is talking about interpretation or processing by humans or automated, which means that the data that you had carried on your ledgers and notebooks did not come within the purview of IT Act of 2000, but it definitely will come within the purview of this act. So one cannot say that I don't have a large computer system, I don't have a large network, I'm collecting data only on pen and paper on ledgers. So will I be governed under this act? Yes, you do. You will come under this act because that is what the definition of data states. That's one. Second, it also distinguishes between what it means of financial data and what it also means as genetic data. Now, the genetic data means personal data relating to the inherited or acquired genetic characteristics of a natural person, which give unique information about the behavioral characteristics, physiology, or the health of that natural person, and which result in particular from an analysis of a biological sample from the natural person in question. Now, you look at the wording of this definition. It talks about behavioral characteristics, which is more to do with your state of mind or kind of embedded culture, which is what Vanita was talking about. So, if you capture that information, the point that the government is actually telling you here is that you can make it into a workable economic model, which a lot of cutting edge research is currently doing, that they are using that data. In fact, if you see, you go to Facebook has got your emojis. I mean, you do emojis. We would think that what is there? We are just giving an emoji like, but that has an implication, because what you do would then in turn be converted into what kind of information that they can feed in terms of that ad feed. So there is a lot of science behind it. Capturing emotion today, behavior models or cultural models, which can be translated into quantifiable data, is now in vogue. There are a lot of libraries that are available as a ready to use kind of models, which in fact we have used it on our own research. So there is going to be a big change in the way that how the data is going to be seen by the regulator, by the government, when it wants to control the data exchange. So that is something that we need to bear in mind. Just by stating that I don't collect too much of data, I collect a very small set of data, does not wash, because everybody who uses information, if somebody feels that he is wronged or he is affected because of this data is leaked, and some organizations happen to be a conduit for that leak, then that organization can be held responsible. There can be a civil liability. There can also be a criminal liability. Please understand that. All right. So data is, why should, no, we will go to the next. Why should not-for-profit organization should also be data compliant? I have one distinction under law. The law does not distinguish between a for-profit organization or a not-for-profit organization. It only talks about if you collect data, if you process data, and if you use the data, then you are to become data compliant. End of story. Period. You cannot escape that. Therefore, and now going back to the definition, that whether you do it on an automated system or you do it personally, it doesn't matter as long as you collect data. So I do an enrollment form, I keep the enrollment form in the file, and that file gets stolen, and that data is leaked, you can still become responsible and liable. That is the way the law is going to be. Then it doesn't distinguish between use for commercial or non-commercial purpose, because if you look at the definition of the change that is proposed by the Act, which talks about personal data, non-personal data, commercial data, non-commercial data. So it's not no longer worried whether it is for commercial purpose. Even for a non-commercial purpose, if the data can be used, and if it is proven and somebody is wrong, and that person has a recourse to make a claim for compensation or any other action they may require you to do under law. Then impact on the affected parties. So what is the impact? They are setting out as to what are the steps that the data processor needs to do for addressing the impact on the affected parties, right from certain injunctive reliefs or to use or compensate, or to have some kind of a monitoring system. All those things are now going to be key. And the regulatory oversight, there is a requirement for the organizations, whether it is for profit or not for profit, to have a certain compliance. So you need to have a breach. You first of all, you need to register with the Data Protection Authority if you are collecting data and using processing data. And then if you are registered under that, then you have to file a certain set of documents periodically. So that becomes, there is a regulatory oversight, which then would put a pressure on these organizations to have a cost of compliance, a budget for compliance. Now, that is something that most of these organizations have not so far fathomed. They have not kind of even thought about it, but there would be a requirement for these organizations to have a kind of a compliance culture and a compliance process, and also put some resources and budget. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, I think for want of time, we will skip this GDPR's history. You can go through at leisure, but I will tell you the history of our Indian data loss. This we will skip. What happened is, it's actually, though the Indian Information Act of 2000 actually carried was the governing law for all your data kind of breaches or data wrongdoings. It was in 2017 when the Supreme Court of India declared that the right to privacy as a fundamental right. That was a very landmark case. It got reported very extensively, and I would urge people to really go through the judgment, not only the judgment, the arguments you should see for both sides. That it's a fundamental, it's a real interesting read to look at those arguments where both sides have argued that right to privacy, is it a fundamental right or not? And especially there is one set of arguments which was argued by two very young Supreme Court lawyers. They were hardly in their 30s, where they were actually arguing that it is not a fundamental right. It's phenomenally good argument. You should, if you have time, you please read the arguments. Otherwise, you read the judgment. It has the gist of all those arguments stated out. Now, when that was the starting point for the government to see seriously, because it's now declared as a fundamental right, now privacy has to be maintained. And for that, they have, there was a Sri Krishna committee, and which made the baseline, the legal framework. Then they drafted the policy bill, and then they placed it, and the Joint Parliamentary Committee deliberated, and it initial report was placed in Parliament in 2018. Then on 2019, the data bill was actually put on Parliament for passing, while the Lok Sabha passed it, the Rajya Sabha did not pass it. Now, in last year, the government decided that they will make they would make further changes in the bill. So they have taken out the bill. Now they are making the scrapped that previous bill, and they are now coming up with a completely new version of that bill. In fact, the section 3 that I read out just now is from the new version of that bill, which actually brings in a lot of changes, including they are bringing in a term called consent manager. They are bringing in a term called this non-personal data. So all that, and they are also bringing in some changes on user rights. We will see all that. Now, if you look at the countries with similar data laws, you will see all the countries that are democracies, almost all of them have got similar data laws, which means that every democratic country now has recognized that data to be your critical asset, and it is a source of economic wealth. So therefore, every government has realized the need to actually regulate and formulate legislation to manage this segment more stringently. And going forward, you will find more and more regulations come in. Like, for example, already there is a law in India which says that all data processors must maintain the data within the country. And if it is going to, for any cross-border transactions, it needs to be not only a data protection authority has to approve it, you have this for foreign exchange transactions, you need to get an RBF approval. For data cross-border data transactions, you need to have data processing transaction, you need to have a DPA approval. And not only that, you also should also get government approval. To that extent, the government is looking at legislating. We'll go to the next slide. So what are the key features of any data regulation? Please remember that these regulations are still not enforced in India, but they are very likely to be enforced. But these are generally the kind of features that we have found across the world. Almost all the data regulations, including GDPR or CCPA or Australian law, all of them have got these features in some form of that. The first one is accountability and governance. Organizations have to prove that they are doing the right thing. Remember, the onus of proving lies with the data processor. So somebody accuses it that you have not used used it on a right manner, or you have abused the data, then you have to go beyond doubt, which means that you must have an internal system that can actually back your claim that you did the right thing, which is a phenomenal kind of work. So do not take it lightly. These are going to be far-reaching when it comes to the real-world problems. So any organization that is actually going to work on collecting and processing data must have a framework of protecting themselves when it comes to an allegation under a regulation, right? That's the first thing. Second, there is a requirement for a data protection officer. Now, till such time, there was a your data responsibility of data was with the IT kind of a technology. It was relegated to technology problem. People always thought that data resides in systems, and the system owner is the process owner of the system will become the in charge of the system, but it's no longer so. The governments are very clearly understood that understanding data is different from understanding your technology framework or a technological asset, because technological asset is only an enabling infrastructure. It doesn't do anything beyond that. Understanding data is a kind of a business drive. It is more of a business function. Therefore, it has to be manned by a data protection officer separately, who will then become responsible for this accountability and governance. So the government is saying, listen, if there is a wrongdoing, I want a head, and show me the head. This is the guy whose head will be taken off. So data protection officer, they want to fix that accountability for managing data. Then more fields are included. That's what I had already explained, that personal and non-personal data, commercial and non-commercial data, those are things that are included. Then they have also, the law also gives a recourse for the person who's been wrong, whose data has been breached. So they have given certain rights to the data subjects. The data subject is the person whose data is being processed by the organizations. So if I'm a beneficiary, if I am enrolled in a particular type of a scheme and I have given my personal data to you, then I have certain rights. Those we will see some of it, what rights do they have. So that maintaining that rights is a responsibility of the organization. Then consent. You need to take the consent of the data that you are collecting for the use of such data. So there is a lot of earlier we used to simply state that it's called a deemed consent. Unless you don't want the data to be used, in which case you will have to specifically say no, don't use it. Then it is deemed as you can use the data. I can use the data as I deem fit. But today it is not so. I have to specifically, the organizations will have to specifically state for which the data is collected and how it would be used. And if it is to be given to a third party, then you have to take the consent from the person who is providing you the data. So consent is very, very key. The increased regulatory powers and fines. Today, the organizations can be fined up to 4% of their total turnover. That is the GDPR regulation. CCPA has got a similar regulation. Indian government is still debating whether to have a percentage of turnover or a quantum fixed, because some of the other laws like company law has a quantum fixed, but eventually they will come back with the percentage of turnover, because the larger the company, the more would be heavier would be the fine. And not only that, there is one distinction that the Indian government is looking at least in the previous version of that bill, was that criminal liability attached to the data protection officer and the other officers in certain cases. Now, that is a deviation from the other data related laws. If it is under GDPR or under CCPA or under Australia or anywhere else, South Korea, you will find that those are simple civil liabilities. You just pay up the fine and you can go on with your business. However, in India, they said, no, I will, first of all, I will slap you with a fine. Then I can also put you behind bars, which means that I am personally making somebody responsible for data breach. You can't say that an organization, okay, I have made the money, what Google did, Facebook, or what Facebook did. Facebook was slapped with a fine of $5 billion. They ended up paying just 500,000 pounds as a fee, as a fine for this Cambridge Analytica, and they got away with it. Nothing happened. Similarly, Google, for data breach, Google was fined about $2 billion, and they ended up paying about $250. Yeah. Mr. Dattamore, please mute. Right.
Yes, if you
So
can mute yourself.
that is what would happen in India. The criminal liability would be attached, so a case can be filed and somebody can be imprisoned. That would mean that the data processors or the data fiduciary, as they would be called, would be far more responsible and far more accountable, right? Then suppliers liability, that is given, and then the data breach notification to regulator and affection individuals. And this means that the notification, there is a process of notifying your data breach, and there is also now for example, I have a record of, let us say, 1 million beneficiaries. Now I find that about 10,000 records are breached, or at least I have a doubt that 10,000 are breached. Do I notify for the 10,000 or do I notify for the 1 million? The regulator says, no, please notify for the entire 1 million, which means that the cost of notification, cost of monitoring, and the cost of actually running through the process of till such time that the data is secure is very, very high. The companies will have to, either you'll have to up your defense system, or you have to have a very good enabling infrastructure for you to manage this process if it all it happens. Next. Okay. These are the, okay, now I think I have hit 30 minutes.
Yes.
What do I do?
In another 5 minutes, if we can wrap, so that if there are questions, and then we'll close.
Okay. So this would be anyway circular, shared with the people, right? So let us go to the,
yes.
There are a couple of things. Go to the consent slide, and wait. Let us go to this previous one. Let us go to the individual rights. Now, these are the individual rights that are given by the law. It says that the subject access requests. So the data subject can specifically state that what kind of access they are willing to give it to what kind of data processes. So you can set it's a kind of an edit rights in an organization. You can say that this is what you can do. For example, I am collecting. I will tell you some simple examples. Now, if you apply for personal loan today, you give your other data, you give your PAN card data to the DSA, that is the direct sales agents. Now those data are collected and they are put into a server, and those data Now you may take your personal loan or you may not take your personal loan, but your PAN number, your Aadhaar number, your income tax returns are all available for them. Those are being used and sold for some other purposes. One is simply one great fear about this financial, why governments are looking at financial data management to be the key, because that can be used for money laundering. Because it's very, I have 10,000 records, I have 10,000 Aadhaar numbers. Now for 10,000 Aadhaar numbers, I have a black money of, let us say, 10 crores. I can very easily say that donation received from A, donation received from B, donation received from C, and fill in these Aadhaar numbers, and who is there to go and check. And even if you want to check what is the kind of resource you need to do the real check, it was attempted by a company in Lucknow and they got caught, and the CEO is in jail today. Therefore, so that the government is very, very clear. When you have when you collect data, when you're a data processor, please allow the individual to give you the right of use of the data. In fact, you should have a lot of policies that you have to have in the website. If you have a cookie collecting information, then you have to have a cookie policy, take a consent, and then also there are a lot of restrictions that will come. Then the right of portability, right of erasure. A person can actually request you to erase his data. Till now, it was not there. Now it is going to be there. It is in GDPR. It is going to be in the data protection bill. Then right of rectification, you can edit the data. Then right to object and restrict processing. Okay, fair processing notices, and fair processing notices to identify what rights are applicable to processing, as I have explained it. So this is for personal data. Similarly, for non-personal data or non-commercial data or commercial data, these rights are now vested with the individuals who are providing you the data. Therefore, earlier it was easy to actually defend your case in case of a wrongdoing under Information Act. See, Information Act, if you look at Information Act of 2000, the kind of prosecution that happened and the kind of charges that have happened, and eventually the kind of punishments that have been given are very, very far and few in between. There are only a few cases that are worth its while. But going forward, you will find that the act has got the teeth, and therefore the enforcement is going to be very stringent. Let's go to the next one. These are the categorization of data. These are called as special category data, like information on race, information on ethnic region, politics, religion, sex life, genetics, biometrics, health. All these are called special category data, which means that anybody processing special category data will have to become more compliant. So your compliant cost and your compliance requirement becomes higher. Next. Here, this is what you need to do. You have to take a consent. You have to review how you are seeking, obtaining, and recording consent. Whether it is given freely or specific, informed, or unambiguous positive indication of agreement, and cannot be inferred from silence, your pre-ticked boxes or inactivity. And individuals generally have a stronger rights where you rely on consent and must be able to demonstrate the consent was given effective, you have to have an effective audit trail. And individuals have right to withdraw consent at any point in time, which means that you have to maintain a record, and then you have to also maintain a record of what requests that reject requests or remove requests have come, and then edit requests have come, and then you have whether you have done that. So there is a lot of action tasks that one has to perform in just maintaining and managing this data. And for children, again, age 13, but Indian law might fix it at even age 18. So up to that, you have to take a consent from the parents, right? I think with this, we would stop. And if there are any questions, you are always welcome. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to write to us. We will be happy to respond back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I think there are two questions from Mamta. One is, what is the cost of implementing the data compliant actions on non-for-profits or social organizations in India? What is the foreseeable cost? And the second is, of course, on a lighter vein, does this also mean that the data policy will ensure that we are stopped being bothered by marketing calls in the future?
You will not be stopped by probably that. See, that will not stop. The marketing calls will not stop because people will always figure out another way of actually accessing you and try and escape the data, the regulator. So that would not stop. But what it would do is that you would be able to track them down. Now, if there is a real, see, for example, if it is a bother, like, somebody calling you up at vague hours and odd hours and trying to market that product, you can probably block that number and you can have that organization kind of block that. But if the data is abused, if you find that some of your data is being used, for example, this money laundering case, in which case, then you have a recourse to get compensation. Now that is very serious. So companies who are going to use the data, especially companies which are selling the data. See, you get the marketing calls from a source, right? The source is the one which is actually being very cavalier and indiscriminate about to whom they are giving the data to. They will simply say, take some money and give the data, or sometimes they get stolen. They don't have a good security system. All that would be stopped. So those companies are required to put up a good security system from the data leaks. So therefore, you will have a less and less number of people who are fly-by-night operators calling you up. That is going to go down. But people who are very serious and who, because your information can be very, see, remember, day by day, you become more and more clearly profiled, which means that between 2 years back and now, people know more about N. Raveendran and my interests, my preferences, and my habits more today. Therefore, they would be able to more target it better. So companies which find that I am a right kind of a customer would definitely use this data to target me in one way or other. So you will have these calls again and again. But the frivolous and useless calls, they will go down. The targeted calls, they will increase. So every call you get in the future, they would be very targeted. In fact, so much so that when you are happy, you will get some kind of ad. When you are not so happy, still you will get some kind of ad to fit that mood. Companies will target, okay, when you're angry, they will give you some kind of a message communication and try to market some things. Those are, in fact, there are 2-3 very good academic papers which have done on behavioral modeling. Sometimes on a different platform, perhaps we can discuss that. So that is one. That's the answer to the second question. The first question is, how much does it cost? Now, it depends on the organization. For an SME, or for a small organization, if you run your own cloud, if you server or your own cloud, or you do that, you might end up spending a few lakhs to tens of lakhs, probably about 20-30 lakhs, all put together. If you're a large organization, you might end up spending about up to 1 crore for compliance, depending on what is the size of your organization. There is including when you have a data protection officer, you need to pay him well, and those guys are not going to be cheap, because there is a risk reward ratio, right? If there is a wrongdoing, this guy is going to be jailed. So you are not going to get a guy whom you can pay 10,000 rupees and put him as a DPO. He will definitely not. You will get a guy who understands his role and responsibilities, and therefore those guys are skilled, and those guys are not going to be cheap. So it depends, but be aware that organizations of tomorrow, whether you are in for-profit or not for-profit, would be required to become compliant under data laws. And that, like today, Whether you have for profit or not for profit, you have to file your income tax returns. Now, if you want to file your income tax returns, you need to have a chartered accountant. First of all, you need to have an accountant who will record your transactions. Then you need to have a chartered accountant who will audit your books. Then you will go to the tax. There is a tax compliance. There is a process. Similarly, for data protection, there would be a process, there would be a requirement, and there would be a budget that needs to be allocated for managing the services. So it might range from a few lakhs to crores for that matter. Right?
Sure. So I think with that, we come to an end of this this session. So if anyone has any specific questions, do let us know. I think we'll throw it open for and wait for a minute to actually address it. If anyone wants to turn on your audio and do tell your question, it is you can do it now. And to some of you who have been posting, I think that we will be sharing for all those who have registered for this session, we will be sharing the presentations for sure. And depending on Catalyst policy, we would see whether it would be possible for us to share the video recording of the session. So now that there doesn't seem to be a question, so thank you so much for actually joining in. If you don't mind, it will be a good time to turn on your camera and take a photo. It will be good for us to definitely demonstrate that all of us have been on this session. And thank you so much for the very patient hearing. I know 2 hours is a long time, so thank you actually for bearing with us and listening us out. I'd love to connect with all of you personally sometime. And I will leave on the chat my email ID, and do reach out to us anytime to either have a conversation or share some of your thoughts. Would love to also know your feedback from the session, and we have posted a feedback link in the chat. So thank you so much. So I think we can take a screenshot, 1, 2, and 3. Thank you. Yes. So thank you so much for joining in.